November 18th, 1942. The morning mist clings to Guadalcanal's jungle canopy as Private First Class Robert Leckie checks his M1 Garand for the fourth time in 10 minutes. The rifle feels wrong in his hands, too smooth, too effortless. Too unlike the Springfield 1903 bolt action his instructors had praised throughout basic training at Parris Island just 6 months earlier. The Garand's gas-operated system cycles automatically with each trigger pull, chambering fresh rounds without manual intervention. 8 shots loaded in a single en-bloc clip. No bolt to lift, pull, push, and lock between rounds. Leckie's platoon sergeant had called it a crutch for Marines who couldn't shoot straight. Real riflemen, he'd said, made every shot count with bolt-action precision. The Japanese across Henderson Field's perimeter wire would teach them otherwise. In the next 72 hours, Imperial Army doctrine built on decades of bolt-action warfare would collide with American semi-automatic reality. The psychological impact would prove as devastating as the physical carnage. Japan's finest infantry, trained to exploit the predictable rhythm of manual cycling, would face sustained fire that arrived faster than their tactical training could process. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M1 Garand emerged from Springfield Armory in 1936 after 15 years of development by Canadian-American designer John Garand. Military theorists had debated semi-automatic rifle adoption throughout the interwar period, with traditionalists arguing that automatic cycling wasted ammunition and encouraged undisciplined fire. European armies, including Germany, had rejected semi-automatic standardization for their infantry. The Japanese had never seriously considered it. Their Type 38 and Type 99 Arisaka rifles represented refined bolt-action designs, perfected through decades of combat experience, from the Russo-Japanese War through the invasion of Manchuria. Japanese tactical doctrine in 1942 reflected this technological foundation. Infantry training emphasized aimed fire, ammunition conservation, and the methodical rhythm of bolt manipulation between shots. A well-trained Japanese rifleman could fire 15 to 20 aimed rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Imperial Army field manuals calculated engagement distances, expected casualty rates, and tactical advantages based on the assumption that all infantry rifles required manual cycling. American Marines, they believed, carried bolt-action Springfields similar to those used in the First World War. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Production figures told a story that Japanese planners never fully grasped. Springfield Armory had delivered 600,000 M1 Garands by 1941. Winchester, Repeating Arms Company, added another 500,000 by mid-1942. Harrington and Richardson Arms Company contributed an additional 300,000. By the time Leckie landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, American industry had placed semi-automatic rifles in the hands of nearly every Marine and Army infantryman deployed to the Pacific Theater. The technological gap was absolute and unprecedented in modern warfare. The mechanical difference was fundamental. The Garand used expanding gas from each fired cartridge to drive an operating rod that automatically ejected the spent case, chambered a fresh round from the internal magazine, and cocked the firing mechanism for the next shot. Total cycling time, 0.2 seconds. A trained Marine could empty all 8 rounds in 3 to 4 seconds of aimed fire. Reload time with a fresh clip averaged 2 to 3 seconds. Effective rate of fire approached 40 to 50 rounds per minute in sustained combat, more than double what any bolt-action rifle could achieve. Japanese Arisaka rifles required the shooter to manually lift the bolt handle, pull it rearward to extract the spent cartridge, push forward to chamber a new round from the 5-shot internal magazine, and press down to lock the action. Each cycle consumed roughly 2 seconds for trained riflemen, longer under combat stress, when hands shook and fine motor control deteriorated. The mathematical disparity seemed modest on paper. In actual combat, it created killing fields that defied Japanese tactical expectations. Leckie had learned the Garand's manual of arms at Parris Island, but understanding the weapon's operation differed fundamentally from grasping its tactical implications. Marine Corps doctrine in 1942 remained influenced by First World War experience, where ammunition, supply limitations, and bolt-action standardization had shaped infantry tactics. Training emphasized marksmanship over volume of fire. Instructors spoke approvingly of aimed shots and disparagingly of spray-and-pray techniques. The Garand's semi-automatic capability was viewed with suspicion by many veteran sergeants who had learned their craft with manual rifles. This doctrinal ambivalence reflected deeper uncertainty about how semi-automatic weapons would perform under actual combat conditions. The Garand had seen limited action in the Philippines during early 1942, but those defeats provided little useful tactical data. Guadalcanal would be different. Here, American forces would fight sustained defensive and offensive operations against experienced Japanese infantry, employing doctrine refined through years of warfare in China. The collision between bolt-action tactics and semi-automatic firepower would produce results that neither side had fully anticipated. Japanese intelligence assessments of American small arms capabilities were surprisingly detailed regarding some equipment while remaining catastrophically inaccurate about others. They correctly identified the Browning automatic rifle as a squad support weapon and the Thompson submachine gun as specialized equipment for close-quarters combat. But their analysis of standard American infantry rifles remained anchored to outdated assumptions. Intelligence summaries captured after the war showed that Japanese commanders believed most American riflemen carried Springfield bolt actions, with the Garand relegated to specialized units or limited distribution. This intelligence failure stemmed partly from the speed of American mobilization and partly from Japanese preconceptions about Western military doctrine. European armies that Japan studied had largely retained bolt-action rifles for their infantry. The Germans, despite their reputation for technological innovation, had not standardized semi-automatic rifles for common soldiers. The Soviet Union maintained bolt-action Mosin Nagants as their primary infantry weapon. Japanese analysts assumed American choices would follow similar patterns, particularly given the economic pressures of rapid wartime expansion. The assumption carried lethal consequences for Japanese tactical planning. Imperial Army doctrine for night infiltration attacks depended on exploiting the pause between enemy shots. Assault troops were trained to advance during the seconds when American riflemen would be working their bolts, vulnerable and unable to maintain effective fire. Banzai charges relied on closing distance before defenders could reload and resume shooting. Every tactical innovation developed through years of combat experience presumed that enemy infantry possessed capabilities equivalent to Japanese forces. Leckie's first sustained combat engagement occurred on November 19th, 1942, during a Japanese probe against the Lunga perimeter's southern sector. The action began at 2200 hours when Imperial Army infantry from the Sendai Division approached through dense jungle vegetation. Their movement was nearly silent, disciplined troops advancing in small groups designed to infiltrate American positions before launching coordinated assaults from multiple directions simultaneously. Marine listening posts detected the approach at roughly 100 meters, but darkness and jungle growth prevented accurate target identification. The Japanese attack followed doctrine precisely. Lead elements opened fire with Arisaka rifles at 75 meters, aimed shots intended to suppress American positions, while follow-on forces maneuvered for close assault. The cadence was methodical, disciplined, exactly as their training prescribed. Fire, work the bolt, acquire the next target, fire again. Perhaps 12 to 15 rounds per minute from each rifleman, sufficient to pin down defenders armed with equivalent weapons while assault troops closed the distance. Leckie's response violated every instinct his bolt-action training had instilled. Instead of carefully aimed single shots, he fired rapidly, the Garand cycling smoothly with each trigger pull. 8 rounds downrange in less than 4 seconds, the distinctive metallic ping of the ejecting en-bloc clip marking his empty magazine. He had fired more shots in those 4 seconds than a Japanese rifleman could fire in 30 seconds of sustained bolt-action manipulation. The tactical implications were immediate and devastating. The volume of fire from Leckie's 12-man squad was overwhelming. 96 rounds in the initial volley, delivered in roughly 5 seconds. The Japanese advance staggered as leading elements took casualties far exceeding what their tactical planning had anticipated. Soldiers trained to exploit the pause between enemy shots found no pause. When one Marine's Garand went empty, others continued firing. By the time Japanese riflemen had worked their bolts for second shots, the Marines had reloaded and were firing again. The psychological impact proved as significant as the physical casualties. Japanese infantry had been trained that American defensive fire would come in measured volleys, with predictable intervals allowing tactical movement. The continuous semi-automatic fire shattered these assumptions. There was no rhythm to exploit, no pause to advance through, no moment when defenders were universally vulnerable while reloading. The tactical doctrine that had served Japanese forces effectively in China proved catastrophically inadequate against weapons their training had never anticipated. Leckie counted his ammunition expenditure as the firefight ended 20 minutes later. 7 on-bloc clips fired, 56 rounds of .30-06 expended. Japanese casualties in his sector numbered 9 confirmed dead, with blood trails suggesting additional wounded who had withdrawn into the jungle. Marine casualties in his squad, 1 minor wound from grenade fragments. The exchange rate reflected not superior courage or better training, but fundamental firepower advantages that technology provided. The pattern repeated itself across Guadalcanal's perimeter throughout November and December 1942. Japanese night attacks that should have overwhelmed American positions through numerical superiority and tactical surprise were shattered by defensive fire that arrived faster and more sustained than Imperial Army doctrine could. Counter. After-action reports from both sides revealed a widening comprehension gap. American commanders recognized they possessed significant firepower advantages, but initially attributed success primarily to superior marksmanship rather than the Garand's semi-automatic capabilities. Japanese commanders faced more troubling conclusions. Their tactical after-action analyses, captured in unit diaries and operation reports recovered after the war, showed growing awareness that American infantry possessed unexpected capabilities. But the nature of those capabilities remained unclear. Some reports attributed rapid American fire to unusually large numbers of automatic weapons. Others suggested that American troops were wasting ammunition through undisciplined shooting. Few early assessments correctly identified the M1 Garand as a semi-automatic rifle issued to every American infantryman. Lieutenant Tadashi Suzuki's diary, recovered near the Matanikau River in January 1943, captured this confusion with painful clarity. His entry from November 23 described an assault on American positions that had cost his platoon 17 casualties. "The enemy fires without ceasing," he wrote. "Our advance was met with continuous shooting that gave no opportunity for maneuver. Either the Americans possess machine guns in extraordinary numbers, or their rifles function differently than our intelligence assessed. The usual rhythm of infantry combat does not exist in fighting these Marines." Suzuki's observation touched on tactical reality that Japanese command structures were slow to acknowledge. The rhythm of infantry combat, the predictable pattern of fire and maneuver, advance and pause, shooting and reloading had governed battlefield tactics since the introduction of bolt-action rifles in the 1880s. Doctrine from every major military power was built on assumptions about how quickly infantry could deliver effective fire. The M1 Garand had fundamentally altered these calculations, but institutional recognition of this change required time and casualties that Japanese forces could ill afford. American tactical doctrine evolved more rapidly, though not always in directions that maximized the Garand's advantages. Some commanders emphasized ammunition conservation, concerned that semi-automatic capabilities would lead to wasteful shooting. Others recognized that sustained fire created tactical opportunities impossible with bolt-action weapons. The debate continued throughout late 1942 as Marine and Army units accumulated combat experience against Japanese forces, employing tactics optimized for an era of manual cycling rifles. Leckie's platoon participated in offensive operations during early December 1942 that demonstrated how American infantry tactics were adapting to exploit semi-automatic advantages. The attack on Japanese positions west of the Lunga perimeter employed fire and movement techniques, where one squad provided suppressive fire while another advanced by bounds. The critical difference from pre-war doctrine was the volume and sustainability of that suppressive fire. 8 M1 Garands firing in succession could maintain nearly continuous fire while squad members reloaded in rotation. Japanese defenders found themselves unable to return effective fire or maneuver without exposing themselves to sustained shooting. The engagement at Hill 67 on December 9th showcased this tactical evolution. Leckie's company assaulted a Japanese strongpoint consisting of interconnected fighting positions on a coral ridge overlooking the coastal approach. Pre-war doctrine would have called for careful advancement under covering fire, with riflemen advancing during pauses in enemy shooting. Instead, the Marines advanced continuously while maintaining sustained fire that kept Japanese defenders suppressed. When enemy soldiers attempted to work their bolt-action rifles and return fire, they exposed themselves during the seconds required for manual cycling. Those seconds proved fatal against Marines whose rifles cycled automatically. The assault succeeded with remarkably light casualties, 4 Marines wounded versus 23 Japanese killed. But the tactical lessons were still being processed by higher command. After-action reports emphasized aggressive leadership and fire discipline while understating the fundamental role that semi-automatic rifles played in enabling the tactic. The institutional inertia of bolt-action thinking remained powerful enough that many officers failed to fully recognize how profoundly the Garand had altered infantry combat dynamics. Japanese tactical adaptation began in earnest during late December 1942 as unit commanders compiled engagement reports and submitted recommendations through Imperial Army channels. The proposals reflected growing recognition that American firepower required doctrinal changes. Some commanders advocated for increased emphasis on night infiltration attacks that minimized exposure to sustained fire. Others recommended shorter rushes during daylight assaults, reducing the time soldiers spent exposed while advancing. Most significantly, several reports recommended abandoning frontal assaults entirely in favor of flanking movements through terrain that limited fields of fire. These adaptations represented intelligent responses to tactical challenges, but they also revealed the depth of the problem Japanese forces faced. Successful infantry tactics required not just brave soldiers and competent leaders, but equipment capable of competing with enemy weapons. The Arisaka rifle was reliable, accurate, and well suited for the bolt-action warfare that had dominated early 20th century conflicts. It was not, however, capable of matching the sustained fire that M1 Garands delivered. No amount of tactical innovation could fully overcome this fundamental disadvantage. The industrial dimensions of the firepower gap became apparent through casualty statistics and ammunition expenditure rates. American forces on Guadalcanal were firing approximately 3 times as much small arms ammunition per engagement as their Japanese opponents. Some analysts attributed this to wasteful American shooting habits. The reality was simpler. Marines could fire 3 times as much ammunition because their rifles cycled 3 times faster. When both sides were equally motivated, equally trained, and equally determined, the side with superior rate of fire inflicted disproportionate casualties. Leckie's experiences through December 1942 mirrored those of thousands of other Marines and soldiers who were discovering the Garand's capabilities through combat rather than training. His confidence in the weapon grew with each engagement, as the rifle performed reliably under conditions that would have challenged any military equipment. Mud, salt water, humidity, coral dust. The South Pacific environment was hostile to machinery. Yet the Garand continued cycling smoothly. Its gas-operated action proved remarkably resistant to fouling, and its simple field-stripping procedure allowed basic maintenance even in forward positions. The contrast with some other American weapons was instructive. The rising submachine gun, issued to some Marine units, suffered frequent malfunctions in jungle conditions. The Johnson rifle, an alternative semi-automatic design used by some raider units, was accurate but mechanically complex. The M1 Garand achieved a balance of reliability, simplicity, and firepower that made it nearly ideal for Pacific combat conditions. Soldiers who initially mistrusted the semi-automatic mechanism became its strongest advocates once combat demonstrated its advantages. By January 1943, As Japanese forces began their withdrawal from Guadalcanal, the tactical lessons were becoming clearer to both sides. American commanders recognized that their infantry possessed significant firepower advantages that should be exploited through aggressive tactics. Japanese commanders understood that their tactical doctrine required fundamental revision to account for American semi-automatic capabilities. Neither side yet fully grasped the broader implications. The Garand represented not just a superior individual weapon, but a fundamental shift in infantry combat that would influence every subsequent Pacific battle. Leckie cleaned his M1 on the evening of January 7, 1943, as artillery fire signaled the beginning of the final Japanese evacuation from Guadalcanal. The rifle had fired approximately 800 rounds during his 5 months on the island. It had never malfunctioned. The bore showed wear but remained well within acceptable limits. The gas system required minimal maintenance. Most importantly, the weapon had performed exactly as designed in combat conditions that exceeded anything peacetime testing had simulated. Japanese planners were drawing their own conclusions from very different data. Casualty reports from Guadalcanal showed disturbing patterns. Units that had successfully employed similar tactics in China and Malaya suffered disproportionate losses against American forces in the Solomon Islands. The differences could not be attributed solely to American air and naval superiority, important as those factors were. Ground combat, particularly infantry engagements at ranges under 200 meters, consistently favored American forces in ways that Japanese tactical doctrine could not adequately explain. The explanation was both simple and profound. American infantrymen could fire 8 aimed shots in the time Japanese riflemen fired 2 or 3. This rate of fire differential created tactical dynamics that invalidated assumptions underlying Japanese doctrine. Advances that should have succeeded based on numerical calculations failed because defending Marines delivered more firepower than casualty projections anticipated. Suppressive fire that should have pinned down American positions proved ineffective because defenders could return sustained fire that exceeded the volume Japanese tactical planning assumed possible. Captain Masao Hirakawa, an Imperial Army staff officer responsible for tactical analysis, submitted a comprehensive report to his superiors in February 1943. His assessment, based on debriefings with survivors from Guadalcanal, represented one of the first systematic Japanese attempts to understand American small arms capabilities. The enemy infantry rifle, he wrote, appears capable of rapid fire without manual operation between shots. This creates firepower density that our current tactics cannot effectively counter. Recommend urgent intelligence collection regarding American rifle specifications and tactical employment. Hirakawa's recommendations led to increased intelligence focus on American infantry weapons, but by early 1943, Japanese strategic circumstances were deteriorating rapidly. Even if intelligence correctly identified the M1 Garand's capabilities, Japan's industrial capacity could not produce comparable weapons for mass distribution. The Type 99 Arisaka rifle represented the peak of Japanese bolt-action design, but converting to semi-automatic production would have required retooling factories, developing new manufacturing processes, and diverting resources from other critical programs. The decision was essentially made by industrial limitations rather than doctrinal preferences. This industrial dimension of the Pacific War often receives less attention than dramatic naval battles or island assaults, but it fundamentally shaped combat outcomes at every level. The United States could equip every infantryman with a semi-automatic rifle because American industry possessed the manufacturing capacity, skilled workforce, and raw material access to produce millions of precision-engineered weapons. Japan could not match this capability even if its designers had developed equivalent semi-automatic rifles. The technology gap reflected not just different engineering choices, but different industrial foundations. The lessons from Guadalcanal filtered through American tactical circles during early 1943 as Marine and Army units prepared for subsequent operations in the Solomon Islands chain. Training programs began emphasizing techniques that maximized the Garand's semi-automatic advantages. Fire and movement drills incorporated sustained suppressive fire that would have been impossible with bolt-action weapons. Squad tactics evolved to exploit the reality that 8 Marines with M1 rifles could deliver firepower previously, requiring twice that number with manual cycling weapons. Private First Class Eugene Sledge arrived at New River, North Carolina, for advanced infantry training in March 1943. His instructors, veterans recently rotated from Guadalcanal, taught the Garand with an enthusiasm that contrasted sharply with the ambivalence Leckie had encountered just a year earlier. These sergeants had learned through combat that semi-automatic fire saved lives. Their training methods reflected hard-won tactical knowledge about how to employ the weapon most effectively under battlefield conditions. Sledge's company spent entire days on live-fire ranges, learning to maintain aimed fire while moving, reloading rapidly under stress, and coordinating their shooting to create sustained suppressive effects. The emphasis had shifted from individual marksmanship to collective firepower. A Marine who could hit targets consistently at 300 yards was valuable. A squad that could deliver continuous, accurate fire at 100 to 200 yards was decisive. The Garand made this tactical approach possible in ways that bolt-action rifles could not support. The training also addressed ammunition discipline, recognizing that semi-automatic capabilities could lead to wasteful shooting if not properly controlled. Sledge learned to fire in aimed pairs 2 quick shots at each target before moving to the next. This technique maintained rapid fire while avoiding the wild spraying that some commanders feared. The goal was controlled aggression, delivering maximum firepower at critical moments while conserving ammunition for sustained engagements. The balance between these objectives would be tested in the campaigns ahead. Japanese forces were conducting their own training adjustments based on lessons from Guadalcanal and subsequent engagements in New Guinea. Imperial Army tactical directives issued in spring 1943 acknowledged American firepower advantages without fully understanding their source. Recommended countermeasures included shorter movement bounds during assaults, increased emphasis on night fighting, and greater reliance on prepared defensive positions that minimized exposure to enemy fire. These adaptations were sensible responses to observed American capabilities, but they addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental problem facing Japanese infantry was that their tactical doctrine assumed rough parity in individual weapons capabilities. When this assumption proved false, every derived tactical principle became suspect. How far should soldiers advance between seeking cover? The answer depended on how much fire the enemy could deliver during that movement. How long could defenders hold positions against determined assault? The answer depended on their ability to maintain suppressive fire. American semi-automatic rifles had altered these calculations in ways that required wholesale revision of tactical manuals. Such revision required time, resources, and institutional willingness to acknowledge that existing doctrine was fundamentally flawed. Japan in 1943 possessed none of these in adequate measure. The military bureaucracy remained structured around assumptions of tactical and spiritual superiority that discouraged candid assessment of material disadvantages. Officers who too frankly acknowledged American advantages risked accusations of defeatism. The result was tactical guidance that nibbled at the edges of the problem without confronting its magnitude. The next major test of American semi-automatic firepower came at Tarawa in November 1943. The assault on Betio Island required Marines to cross 500 yards of shallow reef under fire from Japanese defenders positioned in reinforced bunkers and fighting positions. The tactical challenge was unprecedented, advancing through water while exposed to enemy fire from prepared positions. American planners expected high casualties, but believed that overwhelming firepower and aggressive tactics would carry the day. Second Lieutenant William Hawkins led his scout sniper platoon ashore in the first assault wave on November 20, 1943. His 40 Marines faced Japanese defenders from the Special Naval Landing Force, elite troops who had spent months fortifying Betio's beaches and interior. The defenders possessed excellent fields of fire, substantial protection from naval bombardment, and orders to fight to the death. They also possessed bolt-action rifles that would prove inadequate against the volume of fire Hawkins' platoon could deliver. The opening minutes of Tarawa demonstrated both the Garand's advantages and its limitations. As Marines waded through chest-deep water toward the beach, Japanese machine guns and rifles opened fire from concealed positions. The Americans could not effectively return fire while moving through water, and the M1's rate of fire advantage meant nothing when shooters lacked stable firing positions. Casualties mounted rapidly as Marines struggled to reach the seawall that offered the first meaningful cover. But once Hawkins' platoon reached positions from which they could fire effectively, the dynamic shifted dramatically. Marines established firing positions along the seawall and began engaging Japanese bunkers and fighting positions with sustained semi-automatic fire. The volume was overwhelming. Each Marine could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute, creating a wall of lead that forced defenders to keep their heads down. This suppressive fire allowed other Marines to maneuver toward enemy positions with demolitions and flamethrowers. Japanese defenders attempted to employ the same tactics that had worked against Chinese forces in previous campaigns. They would fire several aimed shots from a position, then shift to alternate firing points before return fire could be effectively directed. Against bolt-action rifles, this technique exploited the reload pause when attacking forces were vulnerable. Against M1 Garands, it failed completely. By the time Japanese riflemen had relocated and prepared to fire again, the Marines had already emptied their clips, reloaded, and were firing from the same positions, or had themselves moved to new locations. The tactical mathematics were brutal. A Japanese rifleman firing from a bunker aperture might get off 3 aimed shots before needing to work his bolt and shift position. In that same interval, 8 Marines with Garands could deliver 32 rounds toward that aperture, ensuring that at least some rounds would penetrate or ricochet into the position. The firepower differential created situations where Japanese defenders were suppressed by volume of fire rather than accuracy. They couldn't safely expose themselves long enough to deliver effective return fire. Sergeant Thomas McFatter's squad demonstrated these dynamics during the assault on a Japanese strongpoint designated the Pocket on Betio's northern shore. The position consisted of interconnected fighting holes and bunkers with interlocking fields of fire covering the beach approaches. Previous tactics would have called for careful identification of each position, followed by methodical reduction with supporting arms. McFatter's Marines simply advanced while firing continuously, their M1s delivering such sustained fire that Japanese defenders could not maintain effective resistance. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. McFatter's 12 Marines fired approximately 320 rounds total, an average of nearly 27 rounds per man. Japanese casualties in the position numbered 18 killed. Marine casualties, 2 wounded, neither seriously. The exchange rate reflected not just American courage, but technological advantages that Japanese defenders could not overcome through better positions or superior determination. They had been trained to fight enemies whose rifles functioned like theirs. The M1 Garand was not that rifle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese tactical assessment, after Tarawa acknowledged American firepower superiority in unusually frank terms. A captured operations order dated December 1943 included this passage. Enemy infantry possesses rapid-fire capabilities that exceed our defensive planning assumptions. Current tactics predicated on bolt-action rifle parity are inadequate. Recommend emphasis on positions that minimize exposure to direct small arms fire and increased reliance on indirect fire weapons and close assault tactics. The recommendations were sound, but revealed a deeper problem. Japanese forces were being driven toward tactics that played to their weaknesses rather than their strengths. Night infiltration and close assault required extensive training, high unit cohesion, and favorable terrain. Defensive positions that minimized exposure to small arms fire were expensive in time and materials to construct. Meanwhile, American forces continued refining tactics that exploited their firepower advantages across diverse terrain and tactical situations. The industrial dimensions of this asymmetry became starker throughout 1944. American production of M1 Garands exceeded 2 million rifles that year, enough to replace combat losses and equip new units while maintaining substantial reserves. Japanese production of Arisaka rifles struggled to meet basic replacement needs as American submarine warfare disrupted raw material supplies and strategic bombing damaged manufacturing facilities. Quality control deteriorated as experienced workers were conscripted, and factories operated under increasing resource constraints. Technical examination of Arisaka rifles captured during 1944 campaigns showed declining manufacturing standards. Metallurgy became inconsistent, with some rifle barrels showing premature wear. Finish work grew rougher, with machining marks visible on parts that previous production had carefully polished. Most significantly, the careful fitting that characterized earlier Arisaka production gave way to looser tolerances that increased the likelihood of malfunctions. The weapons remained functional, but they represented declining industrial capacity under pressure. American industry faced no comparable constraints. Raw materials flowed freely from domestic sources and secure shipping lanes. Manufacturing facilities expanded continuously, incorporating improved production techniques that increased output while maintaining quality. Worker training programs ensured that even newly hired employees could maintain precision standards. The result was not just quantitative superiority in weapons production, but qualitative consistency that gave American infantrymen confidence in their equipment's reliability. This confidence manifested in combat as Marines and soldiers employed their M1 rifles with aggressive tactics that would have been foolhardy with less reliable weapons. Knowing that the Garand would cycle reliably encouraged rapid fire at critical moments. Trusting that ammunition would be available supported tactics that emphasized firepower over conservation. The psychological impact of this confidence was difficult to quantify but nonetheless real. American infantrymen fought with the assurance that their weapons would function as designed, while Japanese soldiers increasingly questioned whether their equipment would perform under stress. The Saipan campaign in June and July 1944 demonstrated the culmination of tactical lessons learned over 2 years of Pacific combat. American forces employed coordinated infantry tactics that maximized the M1 Garand's capabilities while integrating supporting arms to suppress enemy positions that direct small arms fire could not reach. The result was a combined arms approach where semi-automatic rifles played a central role in a larger tactical system. Staff Sergeant James Day participated in the assault on Saipan's southern beaches on June 15, 1944. His company encountered Japanese defenders who had studied American tactics and prepared accordingly. Instead of attempting to stop the landing at the beach, they had positioned their main defenses inland, where terrain channeled American advances into predetermined killing zones. The defenders had learned that trying to match American firepower at medium ranges was futile. They instead chose fighting positions that forced close-range engagements where their bolt-action rifles remained competitive. Day's first serious engagement occurred in sugarcane fields 300 yards inland from the beach. Japanese infantry from the 43rd Division had dug fighting positions among the cane stalks, creating concealed positions with excellent fields of fire across the approaches. Their plan was sound. Allow American forces to advance into the cane, then engage at ranges under 50 yards, where rate of fire advantages diminished and individual marksmanship mattered more than volume of fire. The plan failed because American tactics had evolved beyond simple reliance on firepower. Day's platoon advanced using bounding overwatch, with one squad providing suppressive fire, while another moved forward. The critical innovation was the intensity and duration of that suppressive fire. 8 Marines firing M1 Garands in rotation could maintain nearly continuous fire for minutes at a time, creating such a dense pattern of bullets that Japanese defenders could not safely expose themselves to return aimed shots. When Japanese soldiers attempted to fire from their concealed positions, they faced immediate return fire from multiple directions. The M1's semi-automatic cycling meant that the first Marine to spot a muzzle flash could fire several rounds toward that position within seconds, forcing the enemy soldier to take cover. By the time other Japanese riflemen in supporting positions attempted to fire, they too were receiving concentrated return fire. The interlocking fields of fire that should have protected Japanese positions instead exposed them to concentrated American shooting from Marines who could deliver sustained fire without pause. Day's squad reached the Japanese fighting positions after a 30-minute advance that would have taken hours with bolt-action rifles. The defenders had fought courageously and employed sound tactics, but they could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage their weapons imposed. Of the 23 Japanese soldiers who had occupied that section of the cane field, 19 were killed and 4 wounded. Day's casualties: 3 wounded, 1 seriously. The exchange rate reflected tactics optimized for semi-automatic capabilities against an enemy still constrained by bolt-action limitations. The psychological dimensions of Japanese defensive experiences on Saipan emerged in captured diaries and post-war interviews with survivors. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi's diary, found in a captured bunker on July 2, 1944, described his deteriorating confidence in Japanese tactical doctrine. "We are told to fire with discipline and precision," he wrote, "but the Americans fire as if ammunition is unlimited. When we expose ourselves to shoot, their response is immediate and overwhelming. How can we employ our rifles effectively when we cannot safely use them?" Yamaguchi's question touched on the core psychological impact of facing weapons superior to one's own. Training and doctrine emphasized that disciplined Japanese soldiers could overcome material disadvantages through superior spirit and tactical skill. But spirit could not make bolt-action rifles cycle faster. Skill could not eliminate the vulnerability that manual reloading created. The reality of combat against semi-automatic rifles forced Japanese infantry to confront the inadequacy of their equipment in ways that undermined the confidence necessary for effective combat performance. American Marines and soldiers experienced the inverse psychological effect. Combat reinforced their confidence in the M1 Garand's capabilities, creating a positive feedback loop where battlefield success validated aggressive tactics that further maximized the weapon's advantages. Veterans taught new replacements that the rifle worked, that rapid fire was not just acceptable but tactically sound, that sustained shooting could suppress and destroy enemy positions. This institutional knowledge, transmitted through combat experience, created infantry forces that fought with confidence, grounded in material superiority. The Peleliu campaign in September and October 1944 tested these dynamics under some of the most challenging conditions American forces encountered in the Pacific. Japanese defenders, commanded by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had abandoned beach defenses entirely in favor of fortified positions in the island's coral ridges. These positions minimized exposure to American firepower, while creating defensive complexes that required assault troops to engage at extremely close ranges where technological advantages diminished. Corporal R.V. Bergen's experiences on Peleliu illustrated both the continued relevance of the M1 Garand and the limitations any weapon faced against well-prepared defenses. His company assaulted Japanese positions in the Uma-Brogel ridges, a complex of coral formations honeycombed with caves and bunkers. The defenders possessed excellent observation, multiple firing positions connected by tunnels, and clear understanding that close-range fighting reduced American firepower advantages. Bergen's first assault on a Japanese cave position demonstrated the challenges. The cave mouth was positioned to provide excellent fields of fire while remaining nearly impervious to direct small arms fire. Marines advancing across the coral would be exposed to enemy fire from multiple angles, while return fire would mostly impact solid rock. The M1 Garand's semi-automatic capabilities meant little when targets were invisible and cover was absolute. The solution required tactics that transcended simple firepower. Bergen's squad used suppressive fire to fix Japanese defenders in their positions, while other Marines maneuvered with demolitions and flamethrowers. The M1s played a supporting role, maintaining pressure that prevented defenders from repositioning, while specialized weapons actually reduced the position. This represented sophisticated combined arms tactics where semi-automatic rifles were important but not decisive on their own. Yet, even in these challenging conditions, the Garand's advantages remained relevant. When Japanese defenders attempted to exit their fortified positions for counterattacks or repositioning, they immediately faced sustained American fire that made such movement extremely costly. a Japanese soldier emerging from a cave entrance to engage Marines with his Arisaka rifle would face fire from multiple M1s before he could work his bolt for a second shot. The semi-automatic advantage remained meaningful even when defenders could negate it through superior positions. The campaign on Peleliu lasted until late November 1944 and cost both sides heavily. American casualties exceeded 10,000, with the 1st Marine Division so badly depleted it required months of reconstitution before returning to combat. Japanese casualties approached 11,000, with virtually the entire garrison killed. The brutal mathematics of the campaign demonstrated that technological advantages alone could not guarantee easy victory against determined defenders in favorable terrain. But the casualty exchange rates told another story. American forces achieved their objectives while maintaining force cohesion sufficient for subsequent operations. Japanese forces fought with extraordinary courage and tactical competence, yet were ultimately annihilated. The difference was not primarily spiritual or tactical, but material. American infantry could absorb casualties and continue fighting because reinforcements arrived equipped with the same reliable weapons. Japanese forces, once depleted, could not be meaningfully reinforced given Japan's deteriorating strategic situation. The industrial and tactical dynamics converged in ways that sealed Japan's fate in the Pacific War. American forces continued developing tactics optimized for semi-automatic rifles while improving their combined arms integration. Japanese forces adapted intelligently to American capabilities, but could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in equipment and industrial capacity. By late 1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was how long Japan could sustain resistance and at what cost to both sides. Technical analysis of rifle performance under Peleliu's harsh conditions showed the M1 Garand continuing to function reliably, despite coral dust, high humidity, and intensive use. Armory reports indicated that rifles sent to depot-level maintenance showed remarkably little wear considering the intensity of combat they had experienced. The gas operating system proved resistant to environmental contamination that would have jammed less robust designs. Most impressively, malfunction rates remained consistently low even after individual rifles had fired thousands of rounds in combat. Japanese Arisaka rifles captured on Peleliu showed the opposite trend. Many displayed excessive wear, with bore erosion and mechanical degradation suggesting either defective metallurgy or inadequate maintenance. Some rifles had been modified in field workshops, with replacement parts that didn't quite match original specifications. These weapons remained functional, but they represented declining industrial capacity that could not maintain quality standards under wartime pressures. The technical decline paralleled tactical circumstances, both reflecting Japan's deteriorating situation. Private First Class John Tatum arrived on Okinawa in April 1945, carrying an M1 Garand that had been manufactured in January of that year. The rifle was virtually new, representing American industrial capacity to not just maintain production, but continuously refresh frontline units with the latest weapons. His Japanese opponents carried Arisaka rifles that averaged 3 to 4 years old, with some dating to production runs from the late 1930s. The age gap reflected industrial realities that shaped combat outcomes as surely as tactics or terrain. The Okinawa campaign, lasting from April through June 1945, demonstrated the culmination of tactical evolution on both sides. American forces employed sophisticated combined arms tactics that integrated semi-automatic rifles into a larger system of mutual support. Japanese forces fought from prepared defensive positions that minimized their technological disadvantages while maximizing terrain advantages. The result was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, with casualties exceeding 100,000 total. Tatum's company participated in the assault on the Shuri defensive complex in May 1945. Japanese defenders had created interlocking positions in coral ridges and limestone caves that provided extraordinary protection from American firepower. The tactical challenge was unprecedented, reducing positions that were nearly impervious to direct fire, while enemy defenders could engage American forces from multiple concealed locations. The M1 Garand remained relevant, but its advantages were constrained by terrain that negated many of its strengths. The engagement that Tatum would remember most vividly occurred on May 12th during an assault on a Japanese position designated Hill 78. His platoon had been tasked with reducing a bunker complex that commanded critical terrain overlooking American supply routes. Intelligence estimated 30 to 40 Japanese defenders in interconnected positions that would require coordinated assault with infantry, tanks, and flamethrowers. The assault began at 0700 hours, with Tatum's squad providing suppressive fire while combat engineers moved forward with demolitions. The tactical approach was methodical, each step carefully coordinated to maintain pressure on defenders while minimizing exposure to return fire. Tatum fired more than 60 rounds during the first phase, his M1 cycling smoothly as he engaged any enemy movement visible from his position. The volume of fire from his squad, 8 Marines firing semi-automatic rifles, created a sustained barrage that forced Japanese defenders to remain in protected positions. Japanese return fire came sporadically, individual shots from concealed positions rather than sustained volleys. The defenders understood that exposing themselves to engage American forces would draw immediate, concentrated return fire. Their bolt-action rifles remained capable of inflicting casualties, but only when used from positions that provided adequate protection. The tactical dynamic had evolved to favor defenders who could minimize exposure while penalizing attackers who had to cross open ground. American firepower advantages remained significant, but terrain and defensive preparation had narrowed the gap. The bunker complex fell after 4 hours of sustained combat. American casualties included 7 killed and 21 wounded. Japanese casualties totaled 34 killed and 6 wounded captured. The exchange rate was far less favorable than earlier campaigns, reflecting improved Japanese defensive tactics and terrain that limited American advantages. But the outcome remained consistent. American forces achieved their objectives while maintaining capacity for subsequent operations, while Japanese forces suffered irreplaceable losses. Tatum cleaned his M1 that evening as artillery rumbled across Okinawa's landscape. The rifle had performed flawlessly, despite hours of sustained firing in humid conditions with coral dust infiltrating every mechanism. The gas cylinder showed carbon buildup, but nothing that simple maintenance couldn't address. The bore remained clean and sharp. After 3 years of Pacific combat across dozens of islands, the M1 Garand had proven itself the most reliable infantry rifle any army had ever fielded in sustained combat conditions. The broader strategic picture by mid-1945 showed American industrial capacity continuing to expand, while Japanese capacity collapsed under sustained bombing and resource deprivation. American rifle production in 1945 would exceed 1 million M1 Garands, despite the war's approaching end. Japanese rifle production had fallen to a fraction of earlier outputs as factories were destroyed, workers conscripted, and raw materials became unobtainable. The industrial asymmetry that had given American infantry their firepower advantage had become an industrial catastrophe that sealed Japan's defeat. The psychological dimensions of this asymmetry manifested in post-war interviews with Japanese veterans. Many described the trauma of facing American weapons they could not match, of watching comrades fall to sustained fire, their own rifles could not answer effectively, of knowing that their courage and training were inadequate against enemies possessing superior equipment. The spiritual emphasis of Japanese military culture had taught that determination could overcome material disadvantages. Combat experience proved otherwise. Conversely, American veterans consistently praised the M1 Garand in post-war recollections. General George Patton famously called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, a quote that captured widespread sentiment among combat infantrymen who had staked their lives on the weapon's reliability. The Garand represented not just superior firepower, but the industrial and technological excellence that gave American forces decisive advantages across every dimension of modern warfare. The final irony of the M1 Garand's Pacific War service was that its tactical impact exceeded what its designers had intended. John Garand had designed a reliable semi-automatic rifle to replace bolt-action weapons. He had not designed a weapon that would fundamentally alter infantry combat dynamics or create firepower advantages so pronounced that enemy forces would require wholesale tactical revision to remain competitive. The Garand's battlefield performance demonstrated that technological innovation could produce results beyond designers' original intent when deployed at scale in actual combat. Japanese military planners had made numerous assumptions about how the Pacific War would unfold. They had assumed their tactical skill and fighting spirit would offset American material advantages. They had assumed that American infantry would carry bolt-action rifles similar to those used in previous conflicts. They had assumed that combat would occur on terms where Japanese forces could exploit their strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The M1 Garand did not win the Pacific War alone. Naval and air superiority, industrial capacity, logistical excellence, and countless other factors shaped the conflict's outcome. But at the most fundamental level, individual infantrymen fighting for yards of coral and jungle, the Garand provided American forces with advantages that Japanese infantry could not overcome. 8 rounds in 3 seconds, 40 rounds per minute sustained, reliable function under any conditions, against bolt-action rifles requiring manual cycling between every shot. These capabilities created killing fields that shattered Japanese tactical doctrine and broke the spirits of soldiers who learned that courage alone could not bridge the technological gap. Staff Sergeant Robert Leckie returned to the United States in January 1946, carrying the same M1 Garand he had carried ashore at Guadalcanal more than 3 years earlier. The rifle had fired thousands of rounds in combat, had been cleaned and maintained under the harshest conditions, had functioned flawlessly when his life depended on its reliability. It was not just a weapon, but evidence of American industrial excellence and technological innovation that had helped win the most widespread conflict in human history. The Japanese soldiers who survived the war returned home carrying memories of weapons they could not match and enemies they could not defeat. Their Arisaka rifles had been well designed and adequately manufactured by pre-war standards. But those standards had proven inadequate against an enemy whose infantry carried weapons a generation ahead in technology and decades ahead in tactical implications. The terror they had felt was not of American courage or tactical skill, but of facing sustained fire that arrived faster than their training had prepared them to counter. The M1 Garand's service would continue for decades after 1945, through Korea and beyond, but its most significant impact was already complete. It had transformed infantry combat from a contest of marksmanship and tactics between equivalently armed opponents into a demonstration that technological superiority could create advantages that no amount of courage or training could overcome. 8 rounds in 3 seconds. It was enough to terrify an enemy and change warfare forever. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.